Okay, so today we're going to finish up section 3. We're still graphing sine and cosine, but today we're going to be shifting the graph left and right. And in the problem, it's going to have how many degrees we're shifting it left and right. So for example, if I give you a question like this and I say, let's do sine, and then we'll have an x minus pi over 4. This pi over 4 is going to tell us how many degrees we're shifting it. Remember, just like all of the other graphs we shifted, when it's in the parentheses, we do opposite of what we would think. We see minus pi over 4, we're thinking we're going to go to the left, to the negative side of the graph, but it's opposite. So this example here would really be a shift of 45 degrees to the right. So whatever number is in the parentheses with the x, that is going to tell you how we're shifting the graph. If it were x plus pi over 4, then this would be 45 degrees to the left. What we're going to need to do is we're going to need to recalculate our labels for the x-axis. The 4 points that we're going to be labeling along the axis to the right of our starting point are going to be 90 degrees apart, and the same thing for the left. So every coordinate that we're going to put on our x-axis is going to be 90 degrees apart. Remember, the equivalent for 90 degrees in radians is pi over 2. So we're going to be adding pi over 2 to complete the right side of the graph, and we're going to be subtracting pi over 2 to get the left side. So let's see what all of this means. So here is the basic sine graph. Remember, the basic sine graph starts at the origin at 0, 0, and then from there it goes up. Now, what was confusing some of my other classes is how you know which way to start in the sine graph. As long as there's not a number in front, we're going to start at 0. We'll start at the x-axis at 0. If it's a shift left or right, we would start on however many degrees we're shifting it. Now, if there's an amplitude and it's a negative amplitude, we go down instead of going up from that first point. But we'll see this as we go through examples. So this is our first example that we're going to try to graph. Again, I need to recalculate my points that are going to be along my x-axis here. So notice in the original sine graph, they go by 90s. It goes from 0 to pi over 2, to pi, to 3 pi over 2, to 2 pi, or 90, 180, 270, 360. Now what I need to do is figure out the new points. So what I'm going to do here, pi over 3, if you remember from your unit circle, is equivalent to 60 degrees. So for this sine graph, I'm going to be shifting my graph and starting 60 degrees to the right of 0. So I need to calculate what 90 degrees is away from the pi over 3. So far, let me go ahead and start setting this up. My first starting point is pi over 3. I need to figure out what the next point is that is 90 degrees away from that. And the way that I get that number is I take pi over 3 and I'm going to add pi over 2, which is 90 degrees in radians. When I add fractions, I need to find a common denominator. My common denominator is going to be a 6. So I'm going to change the bottoms so that the denominators are both 6s. This one, I'm going to times it by 2, and this becomes 2 pi over 6. This one, I'll times it by 3, and it becomes 3 pi over 6. I'll now add them. The next point that I'm going to label is going to be 5 pi over 6. Go to create all the points that are along, or all the coordinates along my x-axis. I need 4 points that are going to be to the right of my starting point and 4 points to the left. So I need to fill in and repeat this 3 more times. All right, so far, this was pi over 3 is 60 degrees. I'll just add in the degrees. Then if I take 60 and I'm adding 90, 5 pi over 6 is 150. And then the next one, I still need to fill in, because remember we want 4 points that are going to be to the right of our starting point. So now let me take the 5 pi over 6, and I'm going to add pi over 2. Now, just want to clarify, is everyone aware that 3 pi over 6 will simplify to pi over 2? It's what I turned it into to make the common denominator. So each time I go to get the new points, I'm adding this, which is equivalent to 90 degrees. Let's finish the right. So I'm going to add this, and I get 8 pi over 6. Now, I know this reduces, but I'm not going to reduce it yet. So let me keep going, because I need to do it 2 more times. So I take 8 pi over 6. I'm going to add 3 pi over 6. I get 11 pi over 6. And then I'll take 11 pi over 6, do it 1 more time. 3 pi over 6. And now I have 14 pi over 6. Now, the ones that need to be reduced, I'm going to reduce them before I label my x-axis. So this becomes 4 pi over 3. This one's okay. This one becomes 7 pi over 3. So this is 7 pi over, no, it's 4 pi over 3, sorry. This one's 4 pi over 3. This one's the 11 pi over 6. And then 7 pi over 3. These are all 90 apart. So this next one would be 240. The next one for quadrant 4 is the 330. And then again, 90 one more time. And this is actually 420. Just so you can see how they're all 90 spaced apart. Now, to get the left side, I'm not going to just put negative pi over 3, negative 5 pi over 6. I actually have to go from the pi over 3, and I need it 90 degrees apart, so I'm going to subtract pi over 2. Remember, for my common denominator, just like I did up here, I'm going to change this into 2 pi over 6 minus 3 pi over 6, which gives me negative pi over 6. So this is actually negative 30 degrees. Because remember, you needed a gap between these two of 90 degrees. Okay, so now I'm going to keep going. I'm going to take my negative pi over 6, subtract pi over 2, which is equivalent to the 3 pi over 6, negative 4 pi over 6. I'm not going to reduce it yet. Negative 4 pi over 6, subtract 3 pi over 6, negative 7 pi over 6. I'm going to do it one more time. Negative 7 pi over 6 minus 3 pi over 6 gives me negative 10 pi over 6. Now when I go to label these on my x-axis, I'm going to reduce this one. 4 over 6 simplifies to 2/3. And then this 10 over 6, negative 5 pi over 3. So now I can label it all along my axis. So over here, blue again. So I have negative 2 pi over 3, which is negative 120. Then I have negative 7 pi over 6 and negative 5 pi over 3. Negative 210, and then negative 300. I'm going to start over here. I've shifted it right. Let's see, let me do it in green so we can see it. So this is where I'm starting. I'm starting 60 units to the right, and now I'm going to start my pattern. There was no negative amplitude. The sine graph normally goes up. There's no amplitude either, so let me add in a 1 here and a negative 1. So from here, I'm going to go up at the 5 pi over 6 to the 1, then back down at the 4 pi over 3 to 0, then to the negative 1 at the 11 pi over 6, and then at the 7 pi over 3, I'm back over here at the 0. So it goes up, down, down, up, and I can repeat the pattern. Now, common mistakes that students are going to make: there is no stopping point for this because it needs to be 90 degrees apart at the y-axis. My next stopping point is negative pi over 6, or this negative 30. So over here is where I put my point. It crosses the y-axis, but where I'm stopping is negative pi over 6. And then from there, go up to the negative 2 pi over 3, up to the negative 7 pi over 6, and then back down over here at the negative 5 pi over 3. Now, I'm not going to use this grid, so just ignore that if it's on your notes. So this time, it's got an amplitude of 2. So I'll label that along my y-axis. Notice the plus sign in here. Again, think opposite. You would normally think you would go to the right, but we're going to be shifting left pi over 4 degrees, which is really 45 degrees. So I need to recalculate my points. So I'm going to, let me go ahead and show my axis here. So here is where I'm going to start. 45 degrees to the left. So at negative pi over 4. Again, I need to get to 90 degrees away from that. So negative pi over 4 plus pi over 2. Common denominator is going to be 4. So I'm going to change this into 2 pi over 4 times the top and the bottom by 2, which gives me pi over 4. These are 90 degrees apart. This is negative 45. This is positive 45. To get to my next point that's now 90 degrees away, pi over 4, add 2 pi over 4, and I get 3 pi over 4. So that'll be the next spot. Again, I want 4 points to the right of my start. So I need to do it 2 more times. So 3 pi over 4 plus 2 pi over 4 gives me 5 pi over 4. And do it 1 more time. 5 pi over 4 plus 2 pi over 4. And I get 7 pi over 4. Now I'm going to calculate the ones on the left. Now, soon as you have your negative pi over 4 and you're subtracting 2 pi over 4, notice you get 3 pi over 4. So you can already see that you really don't need to do the calculations. It's just going to be, if the points are symmetrical. So negative 5 pi over 4, negative 7 pi over 4. I need to do it one more time because I need 4 points to the left of my start. This is where I'm starting. So one more time is negative 9 pi over 4. This equation has an amplitude. It has an amplitude of 2. So let me go ahead and label this as 2, and this is negative 2. The cosine graph normally starts at 1. However, when it's the cosine graph, you start at the amplitude. So I'm going to start at 2, but I'm also starting at pi over 4 because I've shifted it to the left. So this is where I'm starting. For the cosine, we've already put the starting point, so I can't go any higher than this. Now, I do not put a point on the y-axis. My next stopping point to the right is pi over 4. Then at 3 pi over 4, I go down. 5 pi over 4, I'm back at 0. And 7 pi over 4, I'm back up at the 1. So here, 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 here. Don't make your lines connected like a V or a W. They need to have some curve to it. And then over here, at 3 pi over 4, we're here. 5 pi over 4 down, back up to 0, back up to the 2. And there is your sine graph, or cosine, sorry. All right, this one. Again, I'm not going to use this graph. So we have an amplitude of negative 2, and this is a shift of 90 degrees to the right. So let's go ahead and set this up. So my first point is at pi over 2. So if you realize from your quadrant angles, 90 is pi over 2, 180 is pi, 270 is 3 pi over 2, full circle is 2 pi, and I need to go one more, and then beyond that is going to be 5 pi over 2. Now, if you didn't realize this came from the quadrant angles, you could still do pi over 2, which is our starting shift. We always have to add 90. This gives me 2 pi over 2, which simplifies to pi, which is what I labeled. To get my next point, remember, don't take the simplified, take the unsimplified. This gives you the 3 pi over 2, which I already labeled. Then take the 3 pi over 2, add pi over 2 again, and you get 4 pi over 2. And then take the 4 pi over 2, add pi over 2, and that's how I got the 5 pi over 2. This one simplified to the 2 pi. So that's how I got the 4 points beyond my starting point. The other side is just the mirrored image because it's 90s. So negative pi over 2, negative pi, negative 3 pi over 2, and let's see, one more. Actually, we have 0 as a stopping point on this one. So watch what happens so you can see that you get 0. If I wanted to do the calculations, remember you take pi over 2 minus 90. See how I get 0? So 0 is actually going to be one of my stopping points. Because remember, all of these are 90 apart. So now let's go ahead, now that I have all the points on here, let's go ahead and start our sine graph. I need to add in the amplitude. So it's 2 and then a negative 2 here. Sine graph normally starts at 0, 0, but I'm shifting it 90 degrees. Okay, so my starting point is here. Now, normally the sine graph goes up, But because my amplitude is -2, I'm going down to the -2 after I start for the pi point. Then at the 3 pi over 2, I'm back at 0. At 2 pi, I'm up here at the 2. And then 5 pi over 2, I'm here. So it goes like this, 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 this. Now, the next point I'm going to go to is the 0 degrees. So I'm going to come here, and this is where I'm stopping. This one does have a point on the y-axis. Then the pi over 2 is here, or the negative pi over 2, the negative pi, and then here, down, up, up. The next one is a cosine graph. It's got an amplitude of 1/2, and it's got a shift of pi over 12. Notice it's minus pi over 12, so this is going to be a shift to the right of 15 degrees. I'm not going to use this again, it's way too tiny. So I'm going to go ahead and do it here. So my first point is going to be the pi over 12, which is 15 degrees. And then from there, I need to calculate 4 more points 90 degrees apart. So I'm going to add pi over 2. So let's get these next 4 points that are beyond pi over 12 to the right of it. So I'm going to add 90 degrees. It's always 90 degrees apart. I need to find a common denominator between 12 and 2. That common denominator is going to be 12. So I'm going to multiply top and bottom of this one by 6. So this becomes 6 pi over 12. This is what I'm going to add each time to get my next point. So this becomes 7 pi over 12. I'm going to do it again. Take the 7 pi, I'll do it below like I've been doing. So 7 pi over 12 plus 6 pi over 12 gives me 13 pi over 12. 13 pi over 12 plus 6 pi over 12 gives me 19 pi over 12. And I need to do it one more time. 19 pi over 12 plus 6 pi over 12 gives me 25 pi over 12. So 13 pi over 12 goes here, 19 pi over 12 goes here, and 25 pi over 12. I now need to subtract 90 degrees. So I'm taking my pi over 12, subtracting pi over 2. Again, I'm going to turn it into the common denominator, which is 6 pi over 12, and I get -5 pi over 12. Notice this time it's not the mirrored image, so I got to do all the calculations. So -5 pi over 12 minus 6 pi over 12, -11 pi over 12, -11 pi over 12 minus 6 pi over 12 gives me -17 pi over 12. And I got to do it one more time. -17 pi over 12 minus 6 pi over 12, -23 pi over 12. Let's label all the left side here. So -5 pi over 12, -11 pi over 12, -17 pi over 12, and -23 pi over 12. I'm going to put in my amplitude. It's the 1/2 and the -1/2. This is a cosine graph. Normally it starts on the y-axis at 1, but because I have an amplitude, I'm going to start at the 1/2, and I'm also going to shift it to the right. So my first point is going to be right here above pi over 12 at the 1/2. And then from there at 7 pi over 12, I'm down here on 0. At 13 pi over 12, I'm here. 14 back up at the x-axis, and 25 up at the 1/2. So go ahead and connect these. And now let's do the left side. Again, do not put a point on the y-axis. It's not 90 degrees from pi over 12. My next stopping point is the -5 pi over 12, and then the -11 pi over 12, and then here, and then here. And you're done. In the notes here, it says your homework is to graph, I think, on your notes. Is that what it says? Don't do those. If you want to do them for practice, you can. Do the homework problems that are listed on Canvas. When you go to do number 49 and 50, it's got the shift left up and it's got the shift for up and down in front. So let me show you what the problem looks like. So number 49, the problem has y equals -3 plus 2 sine, and then a parentheses, x plus pi over 2. So when we did this on yesterday, this is a shift up and down when there's something being added or subtracted. So because this is a -3, after you do this, I recommend that you graph this. This is what we did today. Do this first, and then take all of your 8 points or 9 points and then shift them all 3 units down. Okay, so you're going to do this part first. You're going to shift it, this is 90 degrees. So you're going to shift it 90 degrees to the left. You're going to add in your amplitude of 2, graph that, and then take that graph and shift them all 3 down. On number 50, it's got, or 50, I think it said number 50, it's got 4 in front. So you'll shift all your points 4 units up. So instead of it listed it back here as a -3, they put it in the front, but whenever you have a number in front or at the end, that's your shift up and down.